So you've taken some photos and you want to put your special feel on them, make them pop a little bit more. Well, no matter if you're taking those on your phone, a DSLR, mirrorless camera, even film scans, you can do some things in editing to make them pop, to make them feel more like you and what you're going for. And that's what we're going to cover in today's video, some of those editing basics. Now, if you want to edit a good photo, you have to take a good photo. And that comes down to what you do before hitting the shutter button, which is your composition and your exposure. Now, if you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, which is shutter speed, aperture, and your ISO, I've created some videos on that already, so I'll link those down below as well as one up here to get you started. Then once you've taken those photos, you have to bring them into an editing software of some sort. If that's on your phone or an iPad or a computer, doesn't matter, you need editing software. And in last week's video, I went through a couple of editing apps for your iPhone and what I recommend. I've also done one for the iPad, so I'll link those as well if you're interested. Now today, I'm going to be using Lightroom on the iPad, but everything I'm going to be covering should be in every app on every device, so no matter what you're using, these should apply. And one last thing before we jump in, consider giving this video a like, a thumbs up, as it really helps out the channel, and subscribe if you haven't already because there are more videos coming your way. Now as we get started, how you use these settings is completely subjective. It's up to you. So I'm going to talk about how they impact your image, but what you end up doing, how much you use these tools is going to be completely up to you and what type of feeling or style you want to go for in your own photography. So first up is exposure, which is basically the brightness of your image. This is probably the most self-explanatory of the settings we're going to talk about today. The higher the exposure, the brighter the image. The lower the exposure, the darker the image. Next up is contrast, which is how far apart the bright areas and dark areas are of your photo. So the higher the contrast, the more stark your image is going to be. And the lower the contrast, the softer your image is going to appear. And now, contrast does impact your entire image, so to get a little bit more detailed, you can use highlights and shadows, where adjusting your highlights is only going to adjust the bright parts of your image. You can bring those down and have a little bit more detail in your highlights, push those up and make just that part of your image a little brighter. Then you also have your shadows, which is going to be very similar, but kind of the opposite of your highlights. So as you bring up your shadows, you're going to be taking those darker areas of your image and making them brighter and only adjusting that area. You're not going to be adjusting those brighter parts. Where if you bring them down, it'll be making them darker and again, leaving the bright areas alone. Now moving on to our whites and blacks. At first, this is going to be very similar to our highlights and shadows, but instead of it being about the brightness, it's going to be about how white and how black certain areas or certain parts of your image are. So instead of it being about how bright all of the bright areas are, those areas still have some color in them, where if you adjust the whites, it's going to move closer and closer to white. And the darker areas, if you move your blacks a little deeper, a little darker, all of that area is going to move into that dark, really pure black area. And so if you bring that up, it's going to bring more detail back, but it's also going to give it a little bit of a faded look. And if you bring your whites down, it'll be a little bit more muted. Those colors will be a little bit more muted. They'll still be there, but they'll be a little bit more dull. Moving on to some things related to color. First is going to be our temperature. You can bring this to a cooler temperature or a warmer temperature, and this really has to do with your own preference. This is something you can do with white balance in camera when you're taking the photo as well, but you can adjust it in editing. The cooler the image, the more blue tones are going to be kind of popping throughout the image, and the warmer the image, the more yellows and oranges are going to pop throughout the image to give it a little bit of that film nostalgic, inviting feel to the image. Similar to temperature, tint is going to be how much of one color is going to be prominent in your image, but instead of it being blue and yellow, it's going to be green and magenta. Now this comes from film and how that is processed, so this is definitely unique to how we edit our digital images and is really subjective, but this again impacts how much green or magenta is in your image on a sliding scale between those two. Now lastly, you have your vibrance and saturation. These are very similar as they adjust the overall colors of your image and how much is popping, how much color is actually present. You can pull saturation all the way down and you're going to have a black and white image, or you can pull it all the way up and it's going to be all color. Every color is going to be right in your face. And again, saturation does this to the entire image, every color that's present. Vibrance is similar, but it's a little bit more subtle. It's only pulling in some of the colors that the software is deciding it needs, that it needs to push just on those colors. My personal recommendation is to lean more on vibrance and less on saturation, as it does give your image a little bit more realistic feel to them as you adjust some of the colors and not every single one. So those are the basic editing tools in Lightroom and most other editing softwares. Remember that it's how you use these, and I would generally say subtlety is key. Going overboard is going to make your images look a little unrealistic in most cases, so be intentional with how you use these tools. That is definitely subjective in my own opinion, but that is my recommendation. Now, once you have experimented, tried different things in these editing softwares, different looks and feels to your photos, go ahead and post those on Instagram and Twitter. Tag me at I'm Aaron Ross. I would love to take a look. That is going to do it for this video. So get out there, make more photos, and I'll see you in the next one.